By 1510, the Spanish understand that they're not right by India. They're not right by China. They're not right by Japan or the Spice Islands. The Portuguese had actually made their way over there by this point, and they're like, dudes, we don't know where you're at. But the Spanish don't understand how far away they are. They don't. Nobody's been across the Pacific at this point, or at least no Europeans have. So nobody understands that Asia is 7,000, however far away it is. They think they might be a couple hundred miles away, maybe a couple thousand miles away. So they think this passage to Asia might exist, or maybe it's not a passage at all. Maybe there's just a hop, skip, and jump over there across the ocean, and we'll be trading for spices in India, China, wherever. So the Spanish will begin to send out these expeditions from the Caribbean. By this point, the Caribbean's been entirely conquered, or at least most places have. There are a handful of small islands where the Spanish haven't conquered yet. But the Tainos have been subdued. They're dying of diseases, attacks, enslavement by the Spanish. The Spanish are on these islands practicing agriculture, collecting the little bit of gold that's on these islands. But some start setting out for expeditions to search for Asia. And what we're going to begin to see in the 15 teens is the mapping of what we know as the Gulf of Mexico and this area off the coast of Mexico and Central America. And what they're going to discover is there's a continent in the way from here to Asia. Now, they don't fully understand that just yet. They think maybe we got to go through a river or something like that. But they understand that there's a whole new continent by the late 15 teens. Well, as these various expeditions are going along the coast of the Americas, they're going to see different American Indian groups, groups that we've talked about before. Like here in Florida, they see these Taino-like groups, sedentary agriculturalists. They're going to start going along the coast of what's today North America. Some people are going to get glimpses of the Mississippi culture from a distance. But the thing that's going to really concern or really interest the Spanish here in this Caribbean, are these civilizations here in Mesoamerica. So as the Spanish are going along the coast of Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula, some are going to see these huge monumental pyramids, these huge cities with 5,000, 10,000 more people in them. And the Spanish are going to be understanding that this isn't India, China, Japan, anything like that, but it does look like these people have a lot of stuff. And as we talked about before, Mesoamerica, this is where the most culturally advanced Indian civilizations are. This is where the most technology, the most gold, silver, that type of thing is in the New World, here and in the Andes. Well, the Spanish start seeing this, and this is going to pique the interest of some of these newly arrived Spaniards, guys like Hernan Cortes. So Hernan Cortes was a bastard. Literally, it was a bastard. He was born illegitimate. So his mother was of the lower class. His father was an elite in Spain. So if you're an elite in Spain at this time, your great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather likely did something for old Spanish king in the Reconquista, some sort of favor that helped win the battle against the Moors, something like that. So his family, his father's family was in the upper class because of sort of the hierarchy that was set up during the Reconquista. Cortez, however, is not going to be upper class. So basically by 1400s, by the end of the Reconquista, the elite are set in stone. Those who are knights, those who did favors from the Reconquista, those are the wealthy in Spain. And if you're born wealthy in Spain, you're probably going to die wealthy, okay? You're going to be considered a noble of high birth. You're going to be somebody who very little you can do will make you lower class. You're going to be automatically respected in Spain. If you're born lower class in Spain, which is a vast majority of the population, some 95% or so, you have very little prospect of getting to the elite status. If you're born poor, you're a rancher, something like that, you're probably going to die a rancher, a farmer. You're not going to become wealthy. There's very little prospect of bettering yourself economically, socially. You're born poor, you're probably going to die poor. Well, Hernan Cortes, this bastard child whose father does not recognize him, is pretty much destined for a life of being a goat herder or something like that. his mother's poor, he's probably going to die poor. Well, as a kid, Hernan Cortes started hearing about these other lower class Spaniards that had been making their way to the Americas and conquering these Taino lands. And they've been claiming these lands in the name of Spain. Basically, if you conquer Taino area, the Spanish regarded as they would regard taking an area from the Moors in the Reconquista. You claim it for Christianity. You can essentially use the people as slaves, and this land is yours. So some of these poor people, similar situation to Cortez, had made something of themselves in this new world. Well, Cortez is going to set out in the early 1500s hoping to have the same fate. Go to one of these areas, conquer, and claim some lands for himself. What you're going to do with those lands after that point, that's a different story, but you can make something of yourself. You can earn property, whereas you probably couldn't before remaining as a goat herder. Well, Cortez will set out, but by the time he reaches the New World, he and hundreds of others, thousands of others eventually, of other Spaniards are going to come in and they're going to find that Cuba, Hispaniola, basically all the lands have been conquered and all the Tainos have been claimed by one person or another. So Cortez is going to arrive and find that there's very little opportunity in the Caribbean. Well, because of this, Cortez is going to take a job as a clerk for the governor of Cuba. So the way the Spanish ran their empire is they would appoint these governors, and you'd have a governor for Hispaniola, a governor for Cuba, and it was these guys' jobs to run things in the name of the King and Queen of Spain, make sure the King and Queen of Spain get their cut of whatever's collected here. So if you're shipping off sugar crops, something like that, they want to make sure it goes through a Spanish port. They want to make sure they get a cut of any gold that's found in this region, things like that. So the King and Queen's representative in the New World. Well, these guys, because they're going to be answering a lot of letters, generally they need somebody who can write for them. They don't have time to deal with all this, the writing themselves, so they need a secretary. Where Cortez actually differentiates himself from most in the lower classes of Spain. He could read and write. So he arrives, he finds no land in Cuba to conquer, but he does find this governor in need of a secretary. Well, Cortez will start working with the governor, and he's actually doing better than most lower class Spaniards in that looks like he's destined for a life of a middling bureaucrat, which is, again, might be a little bit better than a goat herder or something like that. But Cortez dreams bigger. He wants more. He wants to conquer like these people that have come in the past decade. He wants to be like them. Well, when he hears about these guys who had been seeking this passage to Asia, coming back with stories of these kingdoms they're seeing as they're going along the coast of Mesoamerica, Cortez is basically going to dream about, what if I can put together an expedition, claim those lands in the name of Spain? So it's a lot more complicated than this, but basically the Spanish, the way that they would authorize conquest, and the king and queen are distant. They set rules for this, but the rules are rarely followed exactly to a T because they're way across the ocean. But basically they say, go to a new area, introduce yourself, try to introduce Christianity to this kingdom. You can't take over a people unless they voluntarily accept it and then rebel against you. So that's what they used to justify the take over the Tainos. They said they agreed to become our subjects, then they rebelled, and then we were able to fight them. But the way it was actually done in the New World is you just go in and you conquer and you tell the king that they accepted rule and then they rebelled. So the Spanish basically say the MO for the Spanish is go in, and if you find a people, you conquer them, and then you get their stuff. So this you conquering non-Christians just like we conquered the Moors. So Cortez hears about these people in Mesoamerica, and he dreams of going there with Spain's superior technology, conquering them in the name of Spain, claiming the lands, claiming some of the people as his own, and becoming more than a goat herder, more than a secretary to the governor. So in 1518, after hearing these ships come back with these various tales, Cortez is going to go to the governor of Cuba and he's going to say, dude, I've got an idea. What if I put together an expedition? You see these hundreds of people arriving every year from Spain looking to do what the people that came, 1492 this point have been doing, conquer land, but there's no lands left. What if I personally get together an expedition of, say, 600 of these guys? I'll pay for everything. I'll get all the horses. I'll have the men provide their own firearms, their own armor, their own swords, that type of thing. And then we go investigate these lands, conquer them. Again, using the sort of go around conquering the Spanish had. We conquer them, and then we take them in the name of Spain. The Spanish king and queen, whatever we conquer, they're going to get their cut. The Spanish king and queen want percentage of whatever is taken from the Americas. This will make you look great. So Cortez basically says, I'll put the expedition together. I'll pay for everything, or my men will pay for everything. We'll conquer in the name of the king and queen of Spain. You gave permission, so you're going to get credit because we're going to send back a lot of cool stuff. And I'm going to say the governor of Cuba, he's the one that authorized it. I become wealthy, you become famous, the king and queen love you, the king and queen get wealthy off whatever we conquer. Now again, Cortez doesn't know exactly what he's going to conquer. He just heard about these huge cities off the coast of Mexico or on the coast of Mexico, and he wants to go investigate them. So beginning in 1518, Cortez will start petitioning the governor. The governor's going to end up approving Cortez's expedition. Now, he's got to get permission from the king and queen first, which takes letters going across the Atlantic and then coming back. But he says, go ahead and start assembling your expedition, Cortez. This sounds like a good idea. So Cortez starts putting his men together, gets 600 guys, gets a couple ships, starts loading the ships. Now, what happens next? This isn't exactly how it happened, but I like to think that this is a better way to sort of portray the idea. I want you to imagine Cortez about to set off towards the end of 1518 and loading his guys up, loading the horses on the ships. They got these harnesses, these wooden boxes filled with swords and guns and stuff like that. He's on the dock and he's like, all right, Bill, load it up, pull it back that way, be careful because the horse, hey, all this crazy stuff as they are getting ready to go. And Cortez is dreaming of becoming this conqueror, becoming wealthy, becoming the person that his bastard status wouldn't let him be. Well, as he's doing this, he hears this, hey, Hernan Cortes, and he sees the governor of Cuba running up the dock and basically telling him, all right, Cortez, I got some bad news. So the king and queen just wrote, call off your expedition. They got another guy. This guy's an elite. His name's Panfilo de Narvaez. He heard about these huge cities off the coast of Mexico, or on the coast of Mexico. He's going to investigate them. They don't necessarily want you to do it. You're kind of a bastard. You're a lower class guy. They'd rather Panfilo de Narvaez take care of this. So go ahead and offload all your horses. Take off all the swords and guns, and go ahead and go back and be my secretary and accept your life as a middling bureaucrat. Go ahead and do that, Cortez. And I want you to imagine Cortez hearing this news and looking at the governor and saying, wait a minute, what's that behind you? Is that Bigfoot? And the governor's like, what? Bigfoot? Governor looks behind him. I don't see this, Cortez. Where's Bigfoot? That's a tree. Are you talking about this tree? And he turns back around and he sees Cortez scrambling up the top of the boat saying, go, guys, go. And the ship's taking off from the dock. It's not exactly how it happened, okay? Basically, the governor got orders from the king and queen and said, hold off on this expedition. We've got Panfilo de Narvaez is going to put one together. Cortez receives word from the governor, and he decides to sail anyway, in knowing violation of the king and queen's orders, which makes him a criminal in minds of Spain. So he's going to go ahead and sail with his men anyway to conquer this area. His thinking is that I conquer it, and then maybe I'll ask forgiveness once I get done conquering everything. So 1518, he and his 600 men are going to set off in violation of the king and queen's orders. Well, they'll set off, and they're going to initially sail around this Yucatan area. There's a bunch of crazy stuff that happens here. They actually pick up a survivor of a shipwreck from a previous Spanish expedition. They actually pick up a translator. It's kind of crazy. This woman who had been captured from one of these northern Mesoamerican areas, and traded as a slave to this area down here, and they sort of skirt along this area. By this point, they're seeing, what remains of the Mayan Empire. The Mayans are nowhere near what they had been at their peak, but there's still, some pyramids, these huge cities are going along. And eventually they're going to skirt their way to what's today, you would call it maybe central Mexico. This place that's today Veracruz, all right? This place Veracruz. When they get off their ships, they're going to find these monumental cities, these huge cities of 10,000, 20,000 people. What they basically found is the Aztec Empire. So we talked about the people of Mesoamerica. You had agriculture developed there over thousands of years. You started seeing these cities become powerful, form these large armies. They would take over multiple cities. People would feed up to the top city. They would feed, again, laborers, art, food, that type of thing, and allowed single cities to control huge swaths of people. Well, that's basically what happened with these Aztecs. So the Aztecs, their empire's fairly new. It's only been around for a couple hundred years. But the Aztecs were people that settled in this area, this today Mexico City, this city Tenochtitlan. So this is a couple hundred years before the Spanish arrived. And these Aztecs settle on this island in the middle of this lake. It used to be a volcano. There's an island in the center of it. The first Aztecs settle here. And the fact that they're going to have this island or this city in the middle of a lake is going to give the Aztecs an advantage over neighboring Indian groups. So again, when the Aztecs first settled here, everybody in Mesoamerica is growing food. Everybody's sedentary agriculturalists. Multiple empires have risen and fallen in this region. So the Aztecs, these sedentary agriculturalists, settle here. Well, the fact that they're on the lake is going to allow them to defend their city better than neighboring cities. So whereas, let's say, this city over here run by Bill, the city over here run by Steve, they're going to be constantly fighting one another, losing population for those regions, maybe having one thing stolen by this next guy. The Aztecs aren't going to have to worry about that as much because in order to get to this place, you either got to go across these bridges the Aztecs built, or these canoes, bring a canoe, but the Aztecs are going to build essentially a navy to surround their city to protect it. So they got a good defensive city. Another thing that's going to make living on a lake good for the Aztecs and make their population grow is the fact that the people of the Americas didn't have the wheel as a transportation vehicle. They had it as toys. So if you want to bring food to a city, if you were doing it in modern times, you could do it obviously by plane or train or car or something like that. But if you're in the Americas where they don't have a wheeled vehicle, they don't have domesticated animals. In the Andes, they have alpacas, but they can't carry very much. You basically got to bring it by a human. So the only, a human if you're surrounded by land, you can only feed a certain amount of people because people can only bring in a certain amount of food to a city. Well, Tenochtitlan, it's surrounded by these fields, and because it got these huge fields and it has canoes can carry a lot more food into the interior than a human can. So you would load up all the food here, load it onto a canoe. You can bring in a lot of food really quickly, which means that Tenochtitlan is going to support a larger population than you could have if a city was just surrounded by land instead of surrounded by water. So this means Tenochtitlan, a couple hundred years before the Spanish arrive, it starts out just a couple 30,000. Well, we don't have to worry about defense as much. Now 50,000. Now we got a lot of food coming in because these canoes are able to bring in, a ton of food or whatever. Instead of 50 pounds of food, what a human can bring in, allows the population to grow a little bit more. Well, this large population will allow the Aztecs to start going to their neighbors and saying, hey, we got a large population, we got a large army, we're going to beat you up unless you give us some of your stuff. Well, the neighbors, they don't have the army the Aztecs do. They don't want to get killed by the Aztecs, so they're going to send some laborers to the Aztecs, some food, some jewelry, some whatever the Aztecs want. Well, the Aztecs are going to go to this neighbor over here, same thing. Give me a population. And then you maybe take the laborers they give you, turn them into soldiers. Maybe now the Aztecs have an even bigger army, and they're going to go to a city down here, expect the same thing. Well, these cities, now they're having to give a lot of their stuff to the Aztecs. They're going to go to their neighboring cities smaller than them, and they're going to say, give me some laborers, give me some food. I got to give my stuff to the Aztecs. I'm going to beat you up if you don't do that. It's almost like a pyramid scheme. So the Aztecs are at the top of this pyramid, which is kind of interesting because the Aztecs, they build these pyramids, but they force these cities near them to feed to them. The cities near them force cities below them to feed them, and then they force the cities smaller than them to feed them. Well, eventually, by the time the Spanish arrive in 1519, the Aztecs have basically incorporated this huge area under their rule. Now, the people of this area aren't calling themselves Aztecs. And as a matter of fact, the majority of them don't like the Aztecs because they're having to give their stuff to the Aztecs in one way or another, either directly or indirectly through the Aztecs demanding it from their neighbor and their neighbor demanding it from them. So they're controlling a lot of people. They're the toughest guys around, but basically they're ruling people that don't necessarily like them. Well, all of this stuff coming in has allowed the Aztecs to create this monumental architecture and this amazing technological achievements. If you got, you don't have to worry about food because people are providing you food. You don't have to worry about, defense. You don't have to. You're getting everybody, your neighboring cities, giving you stuff. You can start creating art. You can have extra laborers to devote to trade. So the Aztecs will have things like cotton clothing. The Aztecs will have this elaborate gold and silver jewelry they put together. They're going to have goods coming from throughout North America in here, stuff from Central America. They're going to have, this textiles you don't see anywhere else. The city of Tenochtitlan has water coming in from neighboring mountains, bringing fresh water, and other channels bringing sewage water out of the city. They're basically creating these huge pyramids in the center of the city. By the way, this is Mexico City today is built on top of Tenochtitlan. We'll talk about why in a second here, but you can still see all these designs, if you go in the sewers or whatever, Mexico City. But they're able to do this because they have all these laborers coming in from these neighboring cities. And the population of Tenochtitlan, by the time the Spanish arrive, has risen to over 200,000. Some people say as much as a 250,000 people. This is a huge city. It's actually the biggest city in the Americas, bigger than any city in Europe. And, except for maybe a couple cities in China, it's the biggest city in the world, okay? So huge city, huge empire. The Aztec Empire, again, some 10 million people directly or indirectly under Aztec control. And again, I don't want you to think of the Aztecs as a nation. It's not like Spain or Portugal where people are more or less voluntarily agreeing this my king, queen. It's, I got to pay these guys some of my stuff every month. But, the Aztecs are able to maintain this control because they're a large population and everybody feeds into it. So huge stuff. Well, when the Spanish arrive on Veracruz, they're going to get off and they're going to learn about the Aztecs from these local Indians. Basically, they hear about the Aztec Empire, and actually the king of the Aztecs, a guy named Montezuma, will actually learn about the Spanish. So he hears about these guys with white faces, beards, again, American Indians, generally darker skin, little facial hair. Here's about these guys with white skin and beards riding these four-legged creatures. Again, domesticated horses don't exist in the Americas, that have these sticks that fire smoke and fire out of them, and these huge boats unlike anything they've seen, and this metal that's shiny. Again, they don't have the metal working that the Spanish do. And Montezuma gets curious. Some people say he thinks they're gods. I think that's pretty much been disproven, but he is curious about them. He's not scared of them. Again, Cortez has 600 dudes. Montezuma controls an empire of 10 million people, but he wants to learn more about these guys. So what Montezuma is going to do is he's going to send emissaries, basically carrying textiles, carrying gold, silver jewelry, to give to Cortez and invite them to meet him in Tenochtitlan. Cortez is going to get these goods, and he's going to see these guys have stuff. The locals say these guys have stuff. I want stuff. I'm wanted back in Cuba. These guys have stuff. So Cortez is kind of in a weird place. He can go back to Cuba, get arrested, or he can go see what this Montezuma guy wants. What he's basically going to tell his guys is, guys, we're going to get rich or die trying. He's going to disassemble his ships and say there's no going back to Cuba. I think we're going to accept this guy's invitation and we're going to conquer this empire. And then maybe we can give it back to Spain and say, hey, look what I conquered in your name, forgive my crimes. Or maybe, we can keep it as our own. So Cortez is going to disassemble his ships, take his 600 guys, and accept Montezuma's offer, and he's going to start journeying to Tenochtitlan to meet with Montezuma. Well, Cortez, he starts traveling along, and he's going to, as he goes along, there's going to be some interesting encounters, but general thing he's going to learn along here is the Aztecs are the boss, but a lot of people don't like them. They don't like the fact they're having to pay up to Tenochtitlan. He also encounters groups like the Tlaxcalans that particularly hate the Aztecs and, basically want to see the Aztec rule brought down. And he goes through this region. He's talking to these various Indian groups. Eventually, he's going to reach Tenochtitlan, and he and his men, again, Montezuma has invited them, but he and his men are going to set off to meet Montezuma in the center of Tenochtitlan. Now, when the Spanish enter, Cortez is basically telling them, guys, I've got a plan. He's like Dutch from Red Dead Redemption 2. Guys, I've got a plan. Trust me on this. But the Spanish, as they enter, they're going to be worried. They look around and they understand we've got horses, they don't. We've got guns, they don't. We've got steel, they don't. But they're 10 million. We're 600. That's a huge disadvantage there. But Cortez is basically going to say, I got it. By the way, one interesting thing, this is a way bigger city than any of the Spanish had seen up to this point. Most Spanish, the biggest city they've seen. Again, a lot of these guys are like Cortez, sort of poor country people. Most of these guys have just seen Sevilla, which is maybe 30,000 people. This is 250,000. So this would be a city, again, was that 8-9 times bigger than they've ever seen. And when Cortez talks about conquering it, they're basically going to pee their pants. Like there's accounts of conquistadors showing up peeing their pants, but Cortez says, I've got a plan, guys. Well, Cortez will reach the center of Tenochtitlan, and he's going to find Montezuma waiting for him. Again, Montezuma's invited these guys, these weird white-faced bearded guys with their crazy animals that you can ride. And Montezuma will come out to greet Cortez. Cortez will come out to greet Montezuma. When Cortez goes to basically shake Montezuma's hand, and there's a lot of sort of disagreement about what happened here, but he basically reaches out to grab Montezuma, and he's going to pull Montezuma in, grab a sword, and then hold it to Montezuma's neck and say, tell your people to give us what we want. What Cortez has predicted is that he thinks the Aztecs regard their king as a god. Spanish do somewhat, basically think he's sort of divinely ordained, but he noticed, and this has happened in the Caribbean, that when you take over these Indians, a lot of them view sort of the higher ups as not only divinely ordained, but actually gods on earth. So Cortez thinks the people are going to not only worship Montezuma, but they're going to think that he's basically a god. So he thinks that by taking this god hostage, he can get the people to do what he wants. He's going to be right. Okay, so after he does this, he tells Montezuma, have your people drop their weapons. I'm going to kill you unless you have them bring me what I want. So for the next 6 months, Cortez is going to order Montezuma to tell his people to go bring he and his 600 men food, women, gold, silver, and they're going to basically live high on the hog in the center of Tenochtitlan. It's basically like they've taken control of the Aztec Empire by virtue of taking the king hostage. Everything looks great. Basically, Cortez's men couldn't have imagined a perfect scenario. again, I find it so interesting. There's so many different accounts of what happened here, but I think this is the one most accepted by historians. So he takes Montezuma hostage, and for 6 months, their dreams are realized. We're never going to go back to Cuba because we've got everything we want here. Well, after 6 months, by this point it's 1520, Cortez is going to get word. Somebody's going to come from the coast, the Aztecs coast, and basically they're going to say, hey, some guys like you just showed up. About 900 guys of white faces, the shiny metal, beards, these weird horses have showed up at Veracruz where you guys came from. The guys are going to be under this guy right here. This guy's name is Panfilo de Narvaez. Panfilo de Narvaez is the guy who the king and queen had sent to take over Mexico, but Cortez had gone off without him. He's basically the guy the king and queen said, hold up on the Cortez expedition. Panfilo de Narvaez is going to take it. He's an elite. He's an aristocrat, a guy the king and queen trust more than Cortez. Well, what had happened was Narvaez, he was coming from Spain. He arrives in Cuba. The Cuban governor basically says, sorry, Narvaez, this Cortez guy has gone in your stead. So sorry, SOL, but he's gone without you. Well, Narvaez is going to say, all right, I'm going to put together my own expedition. I'm going to go arrest Cortez, and I'm going to take the Aztec Empire as my own. So Narvaez assembles his expedition, arrives in 1520. Now Cortez learns about him, that he's over here, and Cortez and his 600 men are over here. Well, this obviously sounds like it's going to ruin everything. This guy's messing up my plans. We just got everything we want. So Cortez is going to decide to deal with Narvaez. He's basically going to leave most of his men behind in Tenochtitlan, say, you guys watch Montezuma. We don't want this guy getting away because without him we can't keep getting this stuff. I'm going to take 250 men. It's about 250 horses they have. I'll take these 250 men. I'll go deal with Narvaez and his 900 men. And he's going to set off to deal with Narvaez. Now, 250 men versus 900 men doesn't sound like it's going to be much of a fight. Well, Cortez is, you can say a lot about him, but he's incredibly military savvy. So when he arrives at Veracruz, he and his men are going to launch this night attack, catch Narvaez and his 900 Spaniards by surprise, and Cortez will start breaking through his lines, but instead of killing Narvaez's men, Cortez will say to the 900 men, dudes, listen, we don't have to fight. As a matter of fact, lay down your arms, quit serving Narvaez, join my side. What you can then do is you can come to Tenochtitlan and you can have whatever you want. Basically, for the past 6 months, we've been getting food, women, everything we want. You guys can get on this as well. Just come over to my side. Well, the 900 men will listen to Narvaez and will defect to Cortez. Narvaez obviously does not. He continues to fight Cortez. There's a lot of different accounts of this battle, but basically one account said he's sitting there on top of one of these pyramids in one of these cities trying to fight Cortez's men with but one of them comes up with a pike, stabs him through the eye. There's another account that says Cortez captures Narvaez, heats up a hot poker, shoves this hot poker in Narvaez's eye, burns his eye out. We're not sure which one of those is correct, but we do know that Narvaez gets captured by Cortez and he somehow loses one of his eyes, whether burned out with a hot poker or whether stabbed with a pike. Narvaez will lose an eye and fall into Cortez's custody. So Cortez is going to take Narvaez and his new 900 men, and he's going to return to Tenochtitlan shortly thereafter. Well, Cortez is going to find that while he's been gone, the Aztecs have been somewhat grumbling because they don't like the fact that they've been having to feed to the Spaniards. And now Cortez shows up with an additional 900 men. So this is an additional 900 people to feed, provide with all of this stuff. And the Aztecs don't like it. And a lot of them are starting to even turn on Montezuma, thinking correctly that he's a puppet of the Spanish. So what are we going to do here? We got all these extra men coming in to feed. We don't want to do it. Well, there's grumbling. There's almost riots outside of the area where they're keeping Montezuma. Well, what Cortez is going to decide to do is send Montezuma out on this balcony and basically at the center of town and make it a speech to the Aztecs telling them, calm down, keep giving these guys stuff that they want. Everything's going to be fine. Well, Montezuma will come out on this balcony. Let's just imagine it's here. He comes out here as he's making this speech. Somebody, again, different accounts here, somebody, we think it's an Aztec in the crowd below, decides, why am I listening to this guy? He's not here for us anymore. He's their puppet. Somebody throws a rock at Montezuma. Imagine it flying through the air, and then boom, hits Montezuma in the head. Montezuma at that point starts falling off this balcony, falls on the ground below, and dies. At this point, do the Aztecs have any reason to continue listening to Spanish? They do not. So what you're going to see is the Aztecs start to fight the Spaniards. And there's going to be this huge battle in central Tenochtitlan. You sometimes hear it referred to as La Noche Triste, or the Sad Night, as the Spanish start to get cut down by the Aztecs, and they sort of have to run their way out of the city. So if you add Cortez and Narvaez's men together, my numbers may be a little bit off here, 1,500 men, but about half of them are going to die in this La Noche Triste as the Aztecs from all throughout Tenochtitlan start ripping them off their horses, stabbing them, basically killing them. Cortez is barely going to make it out alive, but he's going to make it across one of these causeways and basically be chased out of Tenochtitlan. So he runs out, gets a couple hundred of his men. But now here's the problem. Not only has Cortez lost the Aztecs, but now there's no going back to Cuba. Not only have you violated the king queen's orders and taking off for this area anyway, but you've now stabbed their emissary, their guy Narvaez's eyes out, or one of his eyes out. So you can't go back because you're going to be killed. So what are you going to do? Well, what Cortez is going to decide is he's going to run and take his remaining army to this group of friendly Indians over here, these Tlaxcalans, that particularly hate the Aztecs. So this group over here, they're chased out of Tenochtitlan. The 750 or so Spaniards will run to the Tlaxcalans, and Cortez is going to use these guys' cities as a base, and he's going to have them send messengers throughout the Aztec Empire, basically going to every city and saying to these various Indians, and again, cities 10,000, 40,000, stuff like that, saying, guys, are you tired of paying into the Aztec Empire? You're tired of giving them your laborers? You're tired of giving them your food? We're putting together an army to beat them. So 1520, and at this point it's going to be 1521, these Indians are going to start streaming into the Spanish camps here in Tlaxcala. It's actually going to get to the point where every one Spaniard, there's going to be something like 100 Indians. So these Indians are going to form this army behind the Spanish. You'll sometimes hear people say, why didn't Indians fight Europeans together? Well, think about situations like this. They don't view the Spanish necessarily as a threat. There's only 750 of them, but they view them as a way to sort of get back at long-standing grievances. So for past couple hundred years, these guys have been forced to pay the Aztecs. These guys with their fancy horses, fancy swords, it looks like these guys can get rid of them. We don't have to pay them. They're not a threat to us because there's just a couple hundred of them. So let's join with them to fight them. So it's not like they're thinking of themselves as Indians versus Europeans. We're thinking of ourselves as, we hate the Aztecs, or we hate this group over here. These Europeans can be a useful tool to get rid of them. So these Indians will start streaming into Cortez's camp. Cortez is going to form this army, and he and his Indian allies will actually surround Tenochtitlan and its city. So they'll start taking camps around here. They're going to cut off a number of the bridges to where the Aztecs can't get out. And Cortez will actually start ordering boats built, and the Spanish cannons they brought with them put on these boats, and the boats will be sailing around the lake, destroying any canoes that try to get into Tenochtitlan. So the Aztecs are relying on these boats to bring canoes, these canoes to bring food in, but the Spanish boats will start blowing these boats out of the water, which is going to mean the people in Tenochtitlan, some of their bridges are going to be cut. The Spanish are going to be guarding some of the other bridges. They're going to start to starve to death. Boats, by the way, will periodically fire into the city, killing a number of the Aztecs that way. And not only that, we're going to see that while these guys are starving to death, they're actually also going to start dying of disease. One of the guys who arrived with Narvaez's men, so when they showed up with Cortez, they had brought smallpox with them. Smallpox is going to pass from them to the Aztecs. This is a very densely populated city where disease is going to pass very easily from one person to the next. And we'll see that essentially Tenochtitlan will get filled with disease. I've heard different numbers about this. Some people say 50% of the town's infected, and of that, a good percentage are going to start dying of smallpox. So you have a population that's starving, population that's dying of disease, a population that can't get help because they're surrounded by the Spaniards and their Indian allies. And this is going to happen throughout 1521 until August 1521, when Cortez is going to determine that Tenochtitlan is weakened enough for he and his men to attack. Cortez is going to start leading his armies, again, mostly Indian armies, mostly Indian allies, and his Spaniards across these various causeways. There's going to be a ton of crazy fights. These are actually depictions of the battle from native people, either on the Aztec side or on the opposing the Spaniards' Indian allied side. They'll start attacking. The Aztecs will try to fight back. These guys are these jaguar warriors, basically these warriors that dress in jaguar skins. They would carry these obsidian swords. Remember, the Aztecs don't have metal weapons. They have obsidian, which is great and it's sharp. And you'll see doctors use obsidian for scalpels. But the problem is it shatters easily. So these bring these things down on Spanish armor. They're going to shatter, and then the Spanish armor is easily going to cut through their stuff. This depiction right here, you'll see this will be the Spaniards. They're actually being preceded by an Indian ally here, and he's fighting the Aztecs there. The Spanish, this would be one of their boats shooting off cannons, and then you have the Aztecs fighting off their canoes. Another depiction, Aztecs, fighting on the side. The Spanish trying to get past the bridge to get into the interior. The Spanish firing their cannons. They had these crossbows they would use, and again, their guns aren't very good at this point. The technology for the guns isn't great. The cannons are good, but handheld guns aren't great. But they're going to continue to push in. As a matter of fact, the Spanish guns, a lot of people say they're not going to be super effective because the Aztecs had actually developed this cotton armor that is really thick that will deflect some of the Spanish bullets. And the Spanish horses, the Aztecs had built some traps to prevent the horses from getting through. I think basically Braveheart. They set up blockades like that, and then had these little spike pits. But again, the Spanish do have steel, and they do have a ton of people who have allied with them against the Aztecs. So throughout this long battle, this siege of Tenochtitlan, you'll sometimes see it called, or at least the lead up to the main battle, you call that. And then the Battle of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish are going to fight into the center. Again, the Aztecs can't put up as much resistance as they would normally because they're starving and they dying of disease. But eventually the Spanish are going to fight their way into the interior, return to the area where they had been previously, and they're going to take out the Aztec leadership. And what they're going to do at this point is basically Cortez is going to get the remaining Aztec leaders, and he's going to tell them, I'm now the boss. I'm now the boss. I'm in charge. You listen to me. Tell your people to lay down their arms and tell them, now listen to me. Pretend I'm Montezuma almost. He's going to take over Tenochtitlan as himself, and he's going to basically become the emperor of the Aztecs. I want you to almost think of it like in those terms immediately after this battle in 1521. Well, the Indians that fought with Cortez, they're going to be thinking, this is great. Now we no longer have to pay up to the top of this thing. This guy, we've freed ourselves from the Aztecs. What the Indians who fought with the Spanish are going to almost immediately discover is the Spanish are going to take advantage of this political system the Aztecs had already set up, where the Aztecs demand tribute from neighboring cities, who then demand tribute from neighboring cities to them. And basically, Cortez is going to say, you know how you're paying up the Aztecs? Now pay up to me and my men. And he's going to basically start the same system, but instead of Montezuma and the Aztecs being at the top, Cortez and the Spanish are going to be up at the top. Again, if you're an Indian, it would make 100% sense to fight with Cortez against the Aztecs. But if you're looking back maybe 10 years in the future, seeing what the Spanish are doing, I bet a lot of these guys would not have joined with them against the Aztecs, because basically they're replacing Montezuma with Cortez. So that's going to be a result of this. Basically, Cortez will take over what had been the Aztec Empire. Now, it's interesting because Spanish are going to look at this situation and say, what do we do about this guy? Now he's control of his own empire. And Cortez actually contemplated staying in charge of the Aztecs. He's now in charge of an empire of 10 million, although that number, now that disease is being introduced, is going to start dropping rapidly. But now he's in charge of this area. He could have stayed in charge of it, and the Spanish might not have been able to do anything about it. But the king and queen, they're basically going to write Cortez, and they're going to say, hey, listen, if you declare allegiance to Spain, we're going to make you governor of this place we'll call New Spain. We'll call this place New Spain. You're in charge of it. You basically do what you want. Just give us a percentage of what you get out of there, percentage of the gold, silver, the stuff you found there. Just give us a chunk of it, and but you have authority for the most part. So Cortez, he could have maintained the top guy, but instead he's going to go ahead and accept the king queen's offer. And I want you to think about this. This is a guy who was middling bureaucrat at best, is now king of Spain's maybe the most powerful person in the world. Maybe the emperor of China or something's up there. But Cortez is second, third, fourth, fifth most powerful person in the world. The only person he's beholden to is the king of Spain. Somebody with almost nothing has now become one of the most powerful people in the world. What do you think every other Spaniard is going to want to do? Every other lower class Spaniard is going to think, I just need to find my own Tenochtitlan and I can become like Cortez. And what we're going to see as a result of this is conquistadors set out throughout the Americas hoping to duplicate Cortez's success. One thing before we get to that, though, when the Spanish take over Tenochtitlan, they're basically going to start taking down Aztec temples, building Catholic churches to replace them. This is a picture of a place in a city in central Mexico called Cholula, where the hot sauce is from. But forever, people thought there was this hill with a church on top of it. But in reality, what had happened is the Spanish just built a church on top of an existing Indian pyramid. And just over time, grass and dirt had grown over the pyramid, and only today are we realizing that's what happened. And that's basically what happens to Tenochtitlan is all these different Aztec buildings are either disassembled, made into Spanish buildings, or covered over. And again, if you go into the sewers of Mexico City, you'll see some of the old Aztec roads and stuff like that that have now become essentially Spanish. So you've conquered the world. Everybody's noticing. By the way, other European powers, those little tiny Christian kingdoms that are fighting, some of the more united places like England and France, they're starting to see this Indian gold and silver and jewelry coming back. They're going to start saying, well, what the heck is going on over there? But if you're a Spaniard, you now basically think there's a key to becoming powerful. And we're going to see conquistadors start setting off throughout the Americas. Some had already, been exploring a little bit this region, but beginning in 1521, after Cortez's expedition, Spanish conquistadors, conquerors, people seeking to conquer, will set out everywhere. There's going to be some to find what remains of the Mayans. There's going to be a guy that's going to reach down here in the 1530s, a guy named Francisco Pizarro, find these Andean civilization. The largest at the time is the Incas. Pizarro and his brothers will conquer the Incas, and these conquistadors are just going to fan out throughout the Americas. Well, we're going to talk about the ones that make their way to the United States. One of the conquistadors that's going to see what happens to Cortez and wants to duplicate it himself is Panfilo de Narvaez. So after the king and queen forgive Cortez, Narvaez, he's kind of pissed about that. He's like, wait a minute, this should be mine, but you're giving it to him. Which you can be, this guy did it illegally. Why are you giving it to him? Well, the king and queen didn't have a choice because Cortez could have stayed on his own if they didn't sort of forgive him his crimes and let him stay in charge. But Narvaez is like, this should have been mine. Well, what the king and queen are going to say to Narvaez is, dude, calm down. We've got a solution. Why don't you take these lands just north of the area where Cortez is taken? So Cortez is basically taking the Aztec Empire. Why don't you just go north of here? We're sure there's another Aztec Empire. We bet there's 5 Tenochtitlans up there. You go up there, you do the same thing Cortez does. You take over this region. Now we know, but they don't know, this area is incredibly different than this area down here. This area down here is fairly fertile, large Indian civilizations. Up here, primarily hunter-gatherers, a handful of sedentary agriculturalists, but there's no Indian empires. The Spanish don't know that. So Narvaez thinks, all right, fine, this is going to be a good replacement. So he starts putting together an expedition in the 1520s, and this is going to set out in 1528 to take this area. Now, instead of marching out of New Spain and marching north, Narvaez is going to start putting together an expedition in Cuba, and he's going to try to sail to this land grant of his. As part of his expedition, he's going to get 600 guys. One of the guys is going to be this guy right here, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. Cabeza de Vaca. Some people think the Cabeza de Vaca name came from an ancestor fighting in the Reconquista, had allowed people to avoid a more ambush by like putting a path in cow heads, because Cabeza de Vaca means cow head. We don't know if that's true or not, but basically Cabeza de Vaca will be placed as Narvaez's second in command, and his job is going to be to make sure the king and queen get a cut of whatever Narvaez finds. So if he finds the next Tenochtitlan, we want to make sure we get 20% of the gold and silver. So Cabeza de Vaca and Narvaez will start assembling in Cuba 1528 with the intention of settling this area. Well, they're going to take off with a number of ships intending to go here, but this crazy ocean current is actually going to turn them around, and instead of landing over here, they're going to land in Tampa, Florida, which doesn't make any sense. Tampa, Florida is, the land's on the east, not the west, but somehow they make the mistake, think they've landed over here, and basically they're going to get off intending to search for the next Tenochtitlan, thinking they're just north of where Cortez had been. So Narvaez and his men, Cabeza de Vaca, are going to get off, and what they're going to find in this area of Florida is essentially Indians that are like the Taínos. They're sedentary agriculturalists, but they don't got stuff. They've got corn, they've got, a little bit of, a couple villages of a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand in a couple instances, but they don't have the Aztec stuff. They don't have the really cool stuff. So Narvaez and his men are going to start going from one city to the next. Where's the stuff? And what Narvaez will do is actually what Cortez does is he takes the leaders of each of these cities captive, thinking he's going to take over an empire by taking these Indians captive, but he just takes over a town because there's no united empires like there is in central Mexico. So Narvaez goes from one city to the next, and he's searching throughout Florida. Well, he's not gonna find an Indian kingdom, but he finds that Florida's Florida. There's mosquitoes everywhere. It's hot. It's sweltering. It's not perfect for agriculture. So a lot of these Indians, again, they don't have these huge civilizations. And eventually, as he goes from one town to another, word's gonna start preceding him that these weird guys with white faces and horses are coming through. And before Narvaez can start getting to the next city, the city will be abandoned, all its food taken to avoid them. Some Indians will start picking off the Spanish, as their supply lines are falling behind. They're being shot with poisoned arrows. And so the Spanish will slowly start making their way away, but the path is going to be slow. But one thing they are going to be learning as they go along, every Indian they're able to capture, when they ask them, where's the stuff? And the way they translate it's not going to be perfect, but essentially every Indian they capture will be pointing north. They'll say, north is Appalachia, Appalachia. So the Spanish are going to think that this Appalachia, which is, by the way, why we call the Appalachian Mountains, because the Spanish are going to label this area up here as Appalachia, but they're thinking up here is Tenochtitlan. Now, who are the Spanish really, or who are the Appalachians, or who are the Indians of Florida really pointing to? Who would they think is the most advanced people? I'm just going to say this: they're not thinking Mesoamericans, because that's way too far for them to have contact. Who's really advanced for these people? Who they're actually pointing to is the Mississippi culture people. So Mississippi culture, as we know, not as advanced as the Aztecs, but way more advanced than, Taínos, people of Florida. So when they're pointing to Appalachia, they're pointing to the Mississippi culture because that's what's advanced to them. Well, the Spanish are going to make their way slowly up, suffering casualties from starvation, things like that. And they're going to slowly make their way up to the edge of Mississippi culture territory. So they get here and they're going to find, again, impressive cities for our understanding, cities of 5,000 people, huge mounds, palisaded walls, impressive pottery, fields full of corn, just impressive roads between towns. But the people of the Mississippi culture don't have gold or silver like the people of Mesoamerica. They don't have one single ruler. Again, sometimes you get a couple cities under a single ruler, but it's not like you can do with the Aztec Empire where you take out Montezuma and basically rule the top. You don't have that, so it's not easy to take over. There's not the elaborate stuff that the people of the Andes, the people of Mesoamerica have. So when Cabeza de Vaca and Narvaez, their members, reach this area, they're going to see stuff that's cool, and they're going to hear there's even bigger cities in the interior, but they're going to say, this isn't the next Tenochtitlan, or at least not here. And by the way, by the time they reach the edge of Mississippi culture in this area, the Spanish are starving. Their numbers have dropped to something like half. And so they're going to decide, all right, we don't even have the numbers to explore further. And they're going to get their remaining men, and they're going to decide at this point, they had tried to tell the boats to meet them later on. The boats get confused and sail off. So these guys, they didn't think they were going to need boats because they thought they were right north of the area where Cortez was, but now they realize they do. They're going to build some of these boats with the plans to sail back to New Spain. They don't realize they're thousands of miles away. They think they're just right next door. It's just right down here. So these 250 or so Spaniards, including Cabeza de Vaca, including, you see in this picture, some African slaves that the Spanish have brought with them. We talked about the introduction of African slavery. They're going to decide to take off and to reach New Spain. Well, they start sailing September, November 1528. Well, they're going along this Gulf Coast area. They're seeing Mississippi culture cities they pass by. They actually go out to this area. A lot of these guys start, drinking seawater, not understanding or not caring that it's not hydrating. Some of them start actually dying of thirst. At one point here, because of the Mississippi, they actually get fresh water a mile out into the ocean because the Mississippi discharge is so powerful. But they're going to take off, and they're going to start going around here until eventually they're going to be blown into this area that's today the Gulf Coast of Texas. And they're various rafts. So they had built 5 rafts. One with Narvaez on it is actually going to get blown out to sea. We assume Narvaez dies in the ocean, but the one with Cabeza de Vaca will be shipwrecked on the coast of Texas. Well, the area that he's at is the area where there's just hunter-gatherers. So Cabeza de Vaca is going to be wandering around among these hunter-gatherers or very rudimentary agriculturalists for a couple years. Everybody on his ship happens to die of starvation, or we think it's a dysentery. We don't think it's a Spanish-introduced disease, but They start dying in this region. Cabeza de Vaca, for a couple different reasons, happens to survive. He's going to reunite with three other members of one of the other ships, one of whom is actually an African slave named Esteban, and captured by the Spanish in Africa, enslaved because he was non-Christian. Um, and so these these three Spaniards, this one African, are going to start wandering around Texas. They're actually briefly enslaved by some of the hunter-gatherer groups. They're going to have a number of crazy adventures here, trying to reach back to New Spain. At one point, they find a guy from a particular Indian tribe that had gotten shot with an arrow from an enemy tribe. Cabeza de Vaca extracts the arrowhead from him. Some Indians, for a brief time, start regarding Cabeza de Vaca and Esteban and the other two as gods. They're going to start wandering around. They're actually going to make their way up here into what's today West Texas. When they get to this region, so at this point, they've basically been wandering through hunter-gatherers, very rudimentary agriculturalists. They hadn't found anything that's sort of exciting. And even if they did find something exciting, I should point out, these guys are starving. They don't have horses. Their horses have died. And as a matter of fact, most of their metal has either been traded away or they melted it down to build the rafts to get them out of here. So they're just wearing what Indians are wearing. The only thing that's different is they have white and black skin, more facial hair than the Indians are encountering. But by the time they're going to make their way up in 1535, beginning of 1536, to the area that stay West Texas, southern New Mexico, they start getting to the edge of Pueblo territory. As a matter of fact, Cabeza de Vaca is going to start hearing about these people that live to the north, that live in these huge apartment buildings that have. They're going to describe what the Spanish think is copper or copper jewelry. They think they're describing turquoise, or not turquoise, emerald, but it's actually turquoise. And they're going to hear about these huge civilizations to the north. Now, the four survivors of the Narvaez expedition aren't going to make the way up them themselves because they're falling apart, and they kind of just want to get home. Actually, it's kind of interesting. Esteban. We'll talk about this in a second. He probably shouldn't be interested in going home, but they're going to decide, let's not investigate it. Let's go back home. They're eventually going to make their way down to around this area, where they're going to encounter these Spaniards that have been making their way north. As more and more people had come in to New Spain as the Spanish had controlled it. We're going to find these guys coming in, and they'll encounter Cabeza de Vaca's crew, and they're going to be, what happened to you guys? Well, Cabeza de Vaca and his men are going to report to the Viceroy of New Spain. It's actually the guy that had replaced Cortez as the head of New Spain. And Cabeza de Vaca and his three companions, Cabeza de Vaca actually writes a long report over what he and his companions found. And by this point, the Spanish, in just a couple years they've gone, the Spanish have expanded north significantly. They've taken over a huge swath of land. But basically, Cabeza de Vaca and his men are going to say, we didn't see much. Florida, there was a couple people that grew corn. We got to this area, and we think there's just maybe kingdoms to the north of Appalachia, people in huge cities, but not united like the Mesoamericans and not the gold and silver like the Mesoamericans. But we had to take off. Then we found a bunch of people and not much. Then we heard about these kingdoms to the north, but we weren't able to investigate them. Well, he gives this report and basically says there's not much up there, but all Spaniards are going to hear is, wait, you said there might be a kingdom up here? Wait, you said there might be a kingdom up here? And what we're going to see is basically this is going to get all these conquistadors, it's basically going to get them saying that's where the next Indian kingdom is. And we'll see two expeditions set off shortly after Cabeza de Vaca and his men arrive to investigate these areas. One, under Hernando de Soto, will set off to investigate Appalachia. The other, under Francisco Coronado, is going to set off to investigate these Pueblo people. Again, they don't know we know about these groups. They think this is where the next Tenochtitlan is going to be. Cabeza de Vaca, we're not going to get to talk about him anymore. It's really interesting, but he actually goes and has another exploration expedition among the Indians of South America. He is going to end up defending Indian rights. It's really, really interesting. But he'll he'll end up because he's telling the Spaniards not to enslave local Indians. They actually arrest him and put him in chains, send him back to Spain, and say he was not listening to Spain. He's going to face a number of charges, but he's actually going to get off on the charges, although his reputation's ruined. But he becomes a defender of Indians after his ordeal. Esteban, he'll be used as a scout to search for these pueblos. He reaches the edge of Pueblo territory. We actually think he dies. We're pretty sure he dies when reaching the pueblos. But the people that go with him are going to report back to the Spanish, yeah, there's kingdoms up here, right? So Esteban, he's basically sold back into slavery and used as a scout for the Spanish, and he probably dies of Indians killing him in New Mexico. Well, the guy that's going to decide to investigate these rumors of Indian kingdoms in New Mexico is going to be a guy named Francisco Coronado. Coronado, don't need to know much about him. He's kind of a rough, gruff dude. You can kind of see that in this picture of him. But Coronado will have read about Cabeza de Vaca's account of these people in apartment buildings. He'll have read about Esteban's scouting expedition, and he's going to get together some 1,500 people, get permission from the King, Queen of Spain, to go investigate these pueblos. Again, they don't know exactly what they are. As a matter of fact, Coronado's going to believe a rumor that there's kingdoms of gold, these 7 kingdoms of gold. And he actually believes this because the members of Esteban's scouting expedition saw pueblo villages, again, made of adobe, and they think the mica in the soil is gold. So Coronado thinks he's going to go find cities of gold. He's going to get permission from the king, queen to go investigate these pueblo territory in 1540. Well, Coronado sets out. He's going to reach the pueblos. And again, remember what we know about the pueblos. They are impressive. They live in these huge apartment buildings, towns of 1,000, 5,000, sometimes 10,000 plus people. And again, fields of corn, beans, squash, some elaborate pottery, some intricate aqueducts, things like that. But they don't have gold, they don't have silver, and they don't have central leadership. So when Coronado goes among one pueblo village, he's like, where's the gold? Okay, well, we don't really have any. We have a little bit of copper, we have a tiny bit of turquoise, but that's not what Coronado wants. So Coronado is going to basically take over the leader of a pueblo village and say, all right, tell all the neighboring pueblo villages to listen to me. Well, I'm not in control of the neighboring villages. I'm just in control of this. Remember, again, pueblos aren't as advanced as the people of Mesoamerica. They don't have a single emperor or anything like that. So you can't just take one pueblo village over and get command of the others. There's no Tenochtitlan like that. So Coronado will go from one pueblo village to the next, taking them over, not finding gold, not finding silver. And the second he leaves the villages, they basically stop giving to the Spanish. So it's not like you can just, there's no political cords connecting the pueblos like there are the Aztecs. Well, Coronado's going to start to get fed up. Eventually he's going to reach a pueblo village where he's going to find a guy called the Turk. The Turk is a hunter-gatherer Plains Indian. So he's from this area where you still have hunter-gatherers. Basically, these hunter-gatherers occasionally raid the pueblos. The pueblos, a particular village Coronado goes into, had captured the Turk, and the Spanish call him El Turco because he looks Turkish to them. They captured him. Well, when the Spanish are in this pueblo village, the Turk is going to tell them, hey, these guys don't have what you want, but I've heard about a city on the plains, so it's to the east of here. I know about the city that has gold growing from trees. It has these gold cups growing from trees. And you just go to the east a little bit, and you can find this city. Gold growing on trees, that sounds ridiculous, but the Spanish, you got to imagine, they're going into the Americas. They're seeing crazy stuff like they've never seen before. That doesn't sound that ridiculous. So they're going to free the Turk, and Coronado and is going to leave some people behind among the pueblos, but he's going to take some expedition members, and he's going to follow the Turk across the plains. Well, they've been seeing cities all over the pueblo territory, but this area, again, not super great for agriculture until modern technology comes along, obviously. But as they go across here, they don't see anybody. They'll occasionally run into these hunter-gatherer groups of a couple dozen people, but they basically describe the sea of grass where they see nothing. As a matter of fact, the only thing they see are these huge herds of this animal, these bison that they had never seen before. But that's basically the only thing they see for hours and hours on end. Eventually, the Spanish are going to make their way across the plains to the edge of, this is when you start getting agricultural regions again, and they're going to find a place called that the Turk is going to try to explain to them is Quivira. By the way, this is a mural, a depiction of the Spanish. It's kind of interesting because we know exactly where Coronado goes because he keeps this really intricate journal. He describes when they're crossing rivers, and since we know where these rivers are, we know where he goes, and farmers keep digging up equipment from the Coronado expedition. Like Coronado will say it got hot, so we threw down our armor. Farmers dig it up. Okay, this must be where they are on this day. But as they go along, they're going to reach this area, and they're going to get to the edge of the agricultural region. They're going to find this place, and the Turk's going to say, this is Quivira. This is it. And what they're going to find is a sedentary agriculturalist place, but it's not what the Spanish are looking for. It's basically we think it's not a Mississippi culture town. We think it might be a Wichita town. There's corn, beans, and squash, maybe upwards of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. I've even heard higher estimates of that than that of these people. But there's no gold going on trees. There's no, kingdom like Turk described. Well, Cortez is going to say, this is what you told me about. This is this Quivira kingdom you told me about. And he's going to get pissed at the Turk, and he's going to strangle him, basically kill him. Now, it's kind of interesting because we wonder why the Turk would, what the Turk was talking about, why he would make up this city. Well, we think maybe it's one of a couple things. We maybe think that to the Turk, this city is impressive because if you're a Plains Indian, Pueblos are impressive, and these Indians to the east are impressive. We also maybe think that the Turk was simply lying about the trees great with the gold just because he was hoping to get out of slavery among the Pueblos, and then once he got on the plains to escape. We don't know for sure, but he's not going to make it. But obviously being strangled by Cortez or Coronado. But Coronado, after strangling the Turk, he and his men will say, forget this. This isn't what we want. He and his men are going to make their way back to the plains. They're going to go back among the Pueblos. They're going to pick up the people left there, and they're going to say, there ain't crap here. Let's go back to this area. There's nothing here. So Coronado will pick up his people, and he's going to go back. And the whole point of Coronado is basically he's going to draw a map on the western half of North America and say, yes, there's impressive cities over here in the Pueblo territory. Yes, there's a lot of architecture and stuff like that, but there's no gold. There's no central leadership. There's nothing like there is in Mesoamerica. And basically Coronado are going to say this area isn't worth it. He's going to draw a big X on the map and basically say that it's not worth going there. And for 60 years, or almost 60 years, the Spanish are going to ignore this region. They don't go to the American Southwest. They say there's nothing here. It's not worth traveling there. So we get that following Coronado. So Coronado has just basically drawn a map on this area. Well, at the same time that Coronado's setting out, we're going to see a different Spaniard saying the same thing about the eastern half of the United States. And this is going to be the reason why the Spanish don't settle in the eastern part of the United States during this time. This guy's name's Hernando de Soto. De Soto, one of the most experienced military minds alive. He hadn't been with Cortez, the conquest of the Aztecs, but he'd been when the Spanish conquered the Andes. He'd fought a number of Indians before, but he'd always been third in command, fourth in command. He'd never gotten to take anything for himself. Well, after reading Cabeza de Vaca's accounts of this Appalachia, De Soto was going to decide to investigate it himself. He's going to get an expedition of some 600 men, and he's going to get a number of horses, and he's going to get pigs to go with him. Why would this guy get pigs? Well, what he saw with Narvaez, one of the problems they had is they started running out of supplies really quickly. Well, De Soto says, I don't want to run out of supplies. I don't want to run out of meat. One way I can keep everything going is if I carry pigs, because they can eat anything. Well, De Soto will get a number of pigs, 600 men, and they're going to take off, and they will take off from Cuba and land in Florida. Well, they land, and they're going to find initially the same things that Narvaez had found, these sort of Taino-like Indians, sedentary agriculturalists, but nothing that big, and they keep pointing them to the north. De Soto, just like Narvaez, he'll proceed by taking one king of a village or one chief of a village hostage, getting him to bring his food, give him to provide slaves, and then take the next Indian king, chief, and then proceeding north. Eventually, De Soto is going to make his way up to Mississippi culture territory, just to where Cabeza de Vaca and Narvaez had reached the edge. De Soto is going to get into this area, and he's going to start taking these Mississippi culture chiefs hostage, and he's going to keep asking, where's the big stuff? They're going to keep pointing him into the interior, so De Soto was going to go from one place to the next, capturing these Indian leaders. As a matter of fact, he's going one Mississippi town to the next. He eventually makes his way up to this kingdom of pearls, controlled by this female leader. It's kind of interesting. De Soto takes this woman captive, but she ends up escaping and sort of making her way away. But the Spaniards, they don't find gold or silver in these kingdoms. They find pearls, but that's not what they're looking for. And they're going to continue on. Eventually, they're going to make their way into the heart of Mississippi culture in Alabama and Mississippi. But by the time they make it here, and by the time they're going to start seeing cities, 7,000, 8,000, 10,000 people, by the time they make it to this region, people have started to warn about them. So one village will send word to the next, these guys with these weird four-legged creatures, shiny metal, these guys that will capture you if they get you. They're actually going to be at some place in Alabama, we don't know exactly where, this chief of this place called Mobila, and he's actually chief of a couple villages, will say, guys, listen, I don't want to fight you. Why don't you just go ahead and take everything we have so you don't burn us down or take us hostage like you have other people? Well, this chief of Mobila, again, normally you see just one chief rules one village, but this is one instance where you have one chief over a couple villages. He's basically going to say to them, let's meet here. I'm just going to give you everything so you don't have to fight us. Well, the Spanish, by this point, De Soto and his men, they've been journeying for over a year. They're going to say, sure, we'd rather fight and get stuff for free than have to fight for it or whatever. We'd rather get it for free. So they're going to enter Mobila. Mobila doesn't look exactly like this. It is a town surrounded by walls, but there's a ton of pyramids and stuff, or earth mounds in here. Well, when the Spanish enter Mobila, they're going to find the chief at the center of the town with some women dancers and some food laid out, and they're going to throw the Spaniards a feast. And basically the Spanish are going to say, this is much better than having to fight for this, take somebody hostage. Well, very soon, De Soto and his men are going to look around. They're going to notice the houses around them, they're unoccupied. Not only are they unoccupied, but very soon the women are going to disappear. Then the chief is going to disappear. Well, what the Spanish are going to learn is that the chief of Mobila had basically set a trap for them, and he'd gotten all the villages under his command to come together and start fighting the Spanish. They start firing firing arrows into their own village, these flaming arrows. Well, as they're firing these arrows into the village, the Spanish, they're going to trap them inside by locking the walls around it. Spanish are eventually going to fight their way out, and when they get out, they're going to find 5,000 Indians at this Battle of Mobila. So this is going to be this huge battle where 600 Spaniards are going to fight 5,000 Indians. This thing's going to be incredibly bloody. Now, the Spaniards have technological advantage. By this point, they've been fighting for a year against different Indian groups, so they know the techniques the Indians use. The Indians don't know this stuff, so at least not as well. So the Spanish are actually going to kill about 2,500 of the Indians. So half the Indian forces are going to die. Spanish are going to count up the bodies. They're actually going to suspect that hundreds more died after they escaped. The Indians are going to kill about 250 of De Soto's men, seriously wound about 100 more. So I want you to add those numbers up. That's 3,000 people dead in this Battle of Mobila that takes place in 1540. If you look at the battles in American history that took place on U.S. soil, you would find that the number one deadliest battle, or at least day of battle, is this Battle of Antietam. Battle of Gettysburg is deadlier than Battle of Antietam, but it took place over multiple days. But one day battle, Battle of Antietam, is the deadliest day of battle in U.S. history. This is probably the second deadliest day because you had almost 3,000 people died, or, depending on the numbers you believe, over 3,000 people are going to die here. Really, if you count deadliest days in U.S. history, Antietam, maybe 9/11 are going to be deadlier than this. So, yeah, this is incredibly bloody battle, and it happened before one of the first European encounters with Indians in North America. So eventually DeSoto and his men will win, but at this point they're falling apart. A number of their horses died in the battle, a number of their men died in the battle, so they're going to start limping along from one Mississippi culture to the next, continuing to look for the next Tenochtitlan. Eventually they're going to cross the Mississippi River. They don't discover the Mississippi because obviously people had been there before, but they're the first Europeans to cross it. And you can even credit Cabeza de Vaca's men with drinking the water from there, but they didn't see it because it was too far from the coast. But DeSoto's men cross it. They're the first to mark it on a map. Then they're going to continue through this area. Eventually, they're going to get to this region. DeSoto's going to become sick of some disease. We don't know what it is, if it's a disease that maybe American Indians had, Europeans didn't, and he dies of it. Maybe it's a bacterial infection like dysentery. But DeSoto will die. Eventually, they're going to just put his body into the Mississippi to bury it. This is actually a painting I love. This is of DeSoto arriving at the Mississippi River. It's somebody illustrating its discovery of it. This is inaccurate in so many ways. It's such a pretty painting, but it's so inaccurate. Probably the first thing that's inaccurate is that they have these banners that are all so nicely put together. DeSoto looks so regal. His men look well put together. By the point they reach Mississippi, they're falling apart. Their horses, ones that are remained, are probably ragged. Their banners are probably ripped to pieces. DeSoto, he's probably sick, half dead by this point. They definitely don't look like this. The other thing I think is interesting is the teepees. The Indians they're countering our Mississippi culture Indians with huge wooden houses, mounds. They're not Plains Indians. So whoever drew this, I don't know what they were thinking. So very pretty picture, but very, very inaccurate picture. But eventually DeSoto, they're gonna sink him into the Mississippi, and the rest of his men are gonna have to decide, what do we do? Do we keep looking for this kingdom when there doesn't seem to be one? We don't find gold. We haven't found a central ruler. What do we do? Well, his men are going to decide to give it one last shot, travel west. Eventually, they will travel west under this guy, Moscoso Alvarado. You don't need to know his name, but he travels. He reaches the ends of the edge of the plains. He finds these hunter-gatherers, and he's going to determine there's nothing here. Let's head back. Let's go back to New Spain. It's actually kind of interesting. At one point, a woman running away from Coronado's men runs into DeSoto's men. They almost meet up, but she runs into DeSoto's men, and they say, "Who are you running from?" And she basically says, "There's a bunch of Christians over here." They say, "What? You're lying. There's no Christians over there." I don't know what they do with her, but they don't believe her. It'd be kind of interesting because they were so close to meeting up. I think it was just 200 miles or something like that. But obviously Coronado and his men went back this way. DeSoto and his men, or not DeSoto because he dies, but DeSoto's men are going to pack up. They're going to build some rafts, and they're going to head back to New Spain. When they get back, they're going to say the exact same thing that Coronado said about the western part of the United States. There's nothing there. This southeastern part of the United States, there's these huge Mississippi culture cities, but they're not easy to conquer. You got to conquer them one at a time. There's no gold. There's no silver. And basically, they're going to draw a big X on the map, and the Spanish are going to ignore this area for a very long time. We'll step briefly into Florida, but for the most part, they're going to ignore this region. So DeSoto's men will draw an X on the map. Now, something interesting about DeSoto is that these guys are going to give a name to a lot of places in the Southwest. Coronado gives some name to the places in the South, or sorry, Coronado gives some names to the Southwest, but DeSoto and his men, they're going to get back and draw some pretty intricate maps, and they're going to draw names like this is the Mississippi people. You get the river name there. This is the Alabama people. This is where we get a lot of names in the Southeast. If you ever go to the Southeast, you'll hear a lot of Indian names. A lot of these go all the way back to DeSoto's people because they're going to put these places on a map. Another interesting thing about DeSoto and his men, before this point, there'd been no pigs in this region. But during the expedition, some of the pigs from DeSoto's expedition got out. And when they get out, they're going to find an area that is perfectly suited for pigs where there are few natural predators. There are a handful of panthers, things like that. But for the most part, very good. And these pigs are going to just start spreading like wildfire. So today, pigs are a nuisance to the Southeast. They eat farmers' crops. They eat a lot of native species. This starts with DeSoto's expedition. And again, they get out into an area, and if you don't castrate pigs, if you don't raise them in a domesticated area, they turn feral. And so Arkansas Razorbacks, that's a regular pig, but it's just feral pig. And that's first going to come along with DeSoto and his men. And as a matter of fact, when they get out, they can grow to huge sizes. Like this is a pig. I don't know if this perspective on this is right, but they call this Hogzilla or something. Now, this is probably bigger than, or it definitely is bigger than most pigs you'll see, wild pigs you'll see in the Southeast. But these things can grow really large because they're not native to the Americas. They're something introduced by Europeans with DeSoto. Something else about the pigs introduced by DeSoto, we think that some of them are carrying smallpox. So DeSoto, when he was setting off for his expedition, had done a very good job about making sure his men didn't carry disease. They don't want disease infecting the expedition after they set off. So he made sure nobody with disease went with them, but he didn't check the pigs. So what we think happens is that some of the pigs DeSoto brings with him had smallpox, and when they get loose, they're going to spread it to the various American Indians. And when they spread it, this is going to start spreading out of the Southeast. Now, it eventually would have made its way north from Mexico, but the thing that's going to make it particularly unique about what happens with DeSoto is that DeSoto and his men are going to be the only group to really describe the southeastern United States before this disease hits. So if you read DeSoto's journals, which you can on Google Books if you're interested, they'll talk about, we went to this kingdom, we saw this huge village. Nobody else describes the Southeast that way because they're not going to see it until after this smallpox epidemic hits. And as a matter of fact, when we later talk about the English showing up, the French showing up, the Spanish later coming to Florida, they're going to say, all right, we see these large cities and we see these Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw people that, they're densely packed, but they're not going to see the huge cities that DeSoto saw because by the point they arrived there years later, the disease has already wiped out a good chunk of their civilization. So whereas DeSoto saw a huge city with huge earth mounds, the next person that's going to come along is just going to see a hill. Is just going to see, where grass has grown over a hill. So I find it incredibly interesting that DeSoto is one of the his expeditions, one of the few views that we see of the eastern part of North America before disease hits. So these conquistadors just know that in the early 1500s, they spread out hoping to be the next Cortez, but the ones that go to the area that's today the United States, they come back saying, hey, we saw these Pueblo people in the West, but they don't have what we saw in Mesoamerica. We saw these people in the Southeast, these Mississippi culture. They got a lot of big cities, but they don't have what we saw in Mesoamerica. So they're going to draw an X in these maps, and we're going to see the U.S., for the most part, the area that's going to become the U.S., ignored for the next 50, 60 years.